As Pete Miguel navigated the narrow, winding streets of A Coruña, the austere building of the Jefatura Superior de Policia de Galicia began to take form. Against the backdrop of the late evening sky, a construct of solid stone was an unassuming structure that had witnessed countless tales of the city's past. Silent, stalwart, it was the beating heart of law and order in the city. Pete preferred to traverse the city on foot, to lose himself in its labyrinthine streets. The police station was only a 20-minute walk from his apartment, a journey that he undertook at a leisurely pace, his hands tucked deep in his pockets. The evening was beautiful, the sunset casting a warm golden glow over the city, a stark contrast to the chilling events of the morning. As he approached the entrance of the police station, a few uniformed officers greeted him with nods, while others regarded him with veiled suspicion. His reputation as a private investigator put him in an uneasy space in LI. Yet an outsider, he navigated through the maze-like interior, finding Detective Martinez in his cluttered office at the back of the building. He gave a light rap on the door and let himself in. Sergio looked up from his cluttered desk, his face splitting into a weary smile. "Sergio," Pete greeted, accepting the handshake the detective extended. "Pete," Sergio nodded, his gaze wary. He seemed hesitant, glancing around his office before he finally spoke. "Let's take a coffee across the street. We can talk there." Minutes later, as they sat on a weathered bench in the Jardins de Méndez Núñez, a serene park hidden in the heart of the city, a thick silence stretched between them. Sergio was quiet, his face unreadable in the soft glow of the street lamp. His gaze was fixed on Pete, studying him with an intensity that was unsettling. Pete shifted uneasily on the bench, the silence growing heavier with each passing second. He studied his old friend, noticing the faint lines etching deeper grooves into Sergio's forehead, the telltale signs of a mystery that was more complicated than they had anticipated. Unable to bear the silence any longer, Pete broke it. "So, what did you find, Sergio?" he asked, his voice cutting through the soft whisper of the evening breeze. Sergio blinked as if pulled back from his deep thoughts. He took a moment, still silent, before he spoke. His words were careful, measured, as though he were navigating a minefield. "We found a book," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A book?" Pete's mind raced. It was a mundane object in any other context, but in this one, it was a potential key to this puzzle. The weight of Sergio's gaze bore into him, unblinking, analyzing his reaction. A cold realization washed over Pete. Sergio wasn't just sharing information, he was studying him, gauging his response. A subtle, almost imperceptible shift occurred in their dynamic. Sergio wasn't accusing him, but he was exploring the possibility. Pete could see it in his eyes, could hear it in his voice. The trust was there, yes, but so was a hint of suspicion. This was a dance they were both familiar with, a game of hidden truths and unspoken doubts. And in that moment, under the watchful eyes of Sergio, with the enigmatic book casting a long shadow over their conversation, Pete knew that this dance had only just begun. The tension between them thickened, curling around them like the tendrils of fog rolling in from the nearby sea. Sergio's stare was unyielding, a calculated gaze that unsettled Pete more than he cared to admit, his eyes never leaving Pete's face. After what felt like an eternity, Pete spoke again. "A book?" he replied, striving to keep his voice steady. He saw Sergio's eyes narrow slightly at his response, a sign that he was carefully weighing every nuance of Pete's reaction. "Yes, a book," Sergio stated, scrutinizing Pete's face. "Seems a strange thing to find at a murder scene, don't you think?" Pete shrugged, nonchalant. "Could be the victims. People read in parks all the time." He watched Sergio for any indication that his response was satisfactory. "True," Sergio conceded, his gaze unwavering. "But what if it belonged to the killer?" Pete's heart clenched. The thought had occurred to him, but hearing it aloud sent a chill down his spine. He needed to tread carefully here. He was acutely aware of that. That would imply he left it behind. Accidentally, Peep said, his mind racing. Or intentionally, either way it could offer some leads. Sergio took a moment to observe Peep, a heavy silence engulfing them once more. Then, seemingly satisfied with what he saw in Peep's reaction, he let out a sigh. Yes, he murmured, finally breaking his gaze and leaning back on the bench. Either way, it's an intriguing development. Peep seized the moment of respite to collect his thoughts. He was on thin ice, he knew, and he couldn't afford to make a wrong move. He looked at Sergio, a friend who was also a skilled detective, and wondered just how far he would have to go to prove his innocence. Peep took a deep breath, the question hanging heavy on his lips. Sergio, do you think I had something to do with this? The words were out before he had the chance to rethink them. Peep took a deep breath, the question hanging heavy on his lips. Sergio, do you think I had something to do with this? The words were out before he had the chance to rethink them. Sergio's eyes snapped back to him, surprise flashing across his face. After a moment, he let out a soft sigh, his gaze softening. No, Peep, he replied, his tone earnest. I know you're not capable of such a thing. But others do, don't they? Peep pushed, needing to hear the words. Sergio hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Some high. Perhaps they're wary. The fact that you found one of the bodies, your involvement as a private investigator, it's complicated. I understand, Peep admitted, though the sting of suspicion still hurt. It looks bad, but I promise you, Sergio, I'm only here to help. I know, Peep, Sergio said, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. And I'll do my best to keep them off your back, but you need to be careful, all right? We're walking a fine line here. Peep nodded, grateful for Sergio's trust. He knew he had a tough road ahead, but with Sergio's support, he felt confident. He could navigate the tumultuous waters of this case. He just hoped he could do so without losing himself in the process. After a moment, Sergio cleared his throat, his gaze shifting to the coffee cup in his hands. About the book, he began, his tone serious. There's something about it that doesn't sit right with me. Sergio glanced up at Peep, his brow furrowed. In thought, it's a very particular book. An old historical text, something about ancient Galician symbolism. It's unusual, to say the least. Peep leaned back, considering this. You think the killer left it? Sergio nodded. I do. It doesn't fit the victim's profile, and more than that, it feels intentional, like it was left there for us to find. A calling card, perhaps? A chill ran down Peep's spine. The idea of a killer leaving behind such a distinctive clue intentionally was unsettling. He paused, then added, you know, the scallop symbol is a traditional Galician emblem. It's associated with the Camino de Santiago, a pilgrimage that ends in Santiago de Compostela, here in Galicia. Are we dealing with some kind of twisted religious fanatic? Sergio looked up sharply. I hadn't thought of that angle, but you might be onto something. The Camino and the scallop symbol are embedded in our culture. Could be the killer is using that shared understanding against us. It's an intriguing possibility, Peep said. Do we know anything about the book itself? Any markings, inscriptions? Sergio shook his head. Nothing so far, but we're still looking into it. Their conversation trailed off as they retreated into their thoughts. Peep felt a strange sensation, a knot in the pit of his stomach. The mention of the book had unnerved him, opening up a sea of unanswered questions. Who is the killer? What connection does the book have to the murders? Their conversation trailed off as they retreated into their thoughts. Peep felt a strange sensation, a knot in the pit of his stomach. The mention of the book had unnerved him, opening up a sea of unanswered questions. Who is the killer? What connection does the book have to the murders? Was it truly left there intentionally as a macabre calling card, like Sergio suggested? The quiet between them stretched on, filled only by the ambient sounds of the park, the soft rustling of leaves, distant chatter, the occasional chirp of a bird. The calm was a stark contrast to the heavy conversation they'd just had. Just as Pete was about to break the silence, Sergio's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his face tightening. "It's the station," he murmured, his eyes meeting Pete's. "There's a missing person report." The words hung heavy in the air, a cold ripple of dread washing over Pete. His mind instantly made the connection, his heart pounding in his chest. Another woman could be missing, and it fit the pattern. As Sergio rose, excusing himself to answer the call, Pete was left alone on the bench. He was hoping for a breakthrough, but not like this. As he sat there, staring into the distance, his mind whirred with thoughts. The scallop shell killer had likely chosen his next victim,